What's up, everyone? This is JJ Zachariason, special guest at Brazil Fantasy Football YouTube channel. Thanks for tuning in.
Yay! Thank you, JJ.
Yeah.
Here we are, guys. Fala, galera, tudo bem? Estamos ao vivo aqui com esse maravilhoso, especialíssimo convidado, um dos maiores nomes da indústria do Fantasy Football no Brasil. Estamos realmente muito felizes com essa live especialíssima do BRFF, Brasil Fantasy Football, seu canal de Fantasy no Brasil, no YouTube, nas redes sociais, em todo lugar. Eu sou o André Amaral e hoje recebemos aqui JJ Zachariason, ele que dispensa apresentações, né? Mas pode ser mais conhecido por vocês como LateRoundQB, com passagens por Numberfire, FanDuel e que hoje tem seu próprio portal, o LateRound Fantasy Football. Já deixando claro que, infelizmente, a nossa equipe está um pouquinho mais atribulada do que em outras oportunidades, né? 3 papais aqui na redação do BRFF, por exemplo. Por isso, não será possível que a gente realize a legenda da live para exibições futuras. Eu vou passar alguns recados em português, depois a gente vai fazer a dinâmica com o JJ toda em inglês para não ficar muito travado, beleza, pessoal? Mas, mesmo se o seu inglês não seja muito fluente, fique aqui, porque é certo que o conteúdo de hoje vale muito a pena. So, hi, JJ. Thank you so very much for being here. It's our huge honor and pleasure to welcome you to our show tonight. You are a huge inspiration for all of the fantasy football community in Brazil. And we would like to start out by asking you, how was Disney World? It was your first time there as a dad, right?
That was my first time there as a dad. It was amazing. First off, thanks for having me, guys. It's always good to talk to you. It's crazy. I feel like folks down in Brazil, like I feel like there's like a faction of people who like really are into the content that I'm doing and stuff, and it's just awesome. I really appreciate it. There's always love from down there. But yeah, I went to Disney World with my daughter. It was the first time as a dad going to Disney. I've been to Disney a good bit, and it's definitely, I hadn't been really as an adult before, and it's different as an adult just in general. Like you kind of see like the rides where they're like the Little Mermaid ride and stuff like that. You can see like all the strings attached to all the characters and stuff like from the ceiling. And you're like, oh, the magic's kind of lost a little bit. But then you look at, I look at my daughter and she's just loving it. And that's really, the joy that you get out of a trip like that. So it was awesome. Loved it.
Yeah, that must be awesome to see the magic in your daughter's eyes.
Yeah.
It's very, very nice. So just 1 second, maybe lost here. So yeah, before we start with the fantasy football questions, I'll just send some messages in Portuguese and introduce my fellow colleagues so they can say their greetings to you and those watching us, okay, JJ?
Yeah.
Ok, so convidar vocês aí, galera, que já estão bombando no chat, nosso grande Guilherme Gianni, amigaço aí, fantasy futebolista, o editor-chefe da galera aqui, Rui Maurício, Thiago Sena, meu grande amigo Zé Ferraz, a continuarem participando no chat, com perguntas, principalmente, a gente vai ter muito espaço para elas. Nosso Lorde Inglês Derek é o responsável pela curadoria e tradução, se vocês quiserem mandar as perguntas em português também. Curtam o vídeo, se inscrevam no canal, chequem os nossos planos de assinatura no site do BRFF, porque a gente pode te ajudar tanto na opção anual, semestral e também por temporada. Agora vou apresentar meus amigos aqui para eles darem o salve inicial deles e o oi para nosso grande amigo JJ, começando pelo meu co-host da noite, meu grande amigo Caio Bretas, um dos maiores craques do fantasy futebol brasileiro. Como é que você está diretamente das Minas Gerais, Bretinhas? Animado para hoje?
Fala, pessoal. Hello, JJ. It's been a great opportunity to be here tonight and talking to you. Hopefully we can learn a lot and you'll give us some great advice. We're really pumped up for tonight.
Appreciate it.
Boa, e agora, meu outro grande amigo, a quem eu já dei a letrinha aqui, está aqui conosco, o Lorde Inglês Derek Bissigini, ele que tem o sotaque mais parecido com o Harry Potter aqui no Brasil, e está novamente aí para dar um show de fantasy e o oi para a galera nesta noite, né, Derek?
Boa noite, pessoal. Good night, JJ. How are you doing? Thank you. I wish you have a very pleasant time here with us, even with my weird accent. But let's go.
Okay, so let's get started, guys. So JJ, it's dynasty season, right? And a lot of startup drafts are happening, especially here in Brazil, where the format is growing more popular each year. Can you please explain, as briefly as you can, or not so briefly, about the appreciation in value for rookies in general, something you touched on in one of your latest Rewind episodes, and why it may be advisable to take a productive struggle approach in startup drafts, as me myself tried it even before the NFL draft happened. In the latest one that we here at Brazil Fantasy Football did. My team basically has a bunch of rookies and no one that's not a first, second, or third year player, and I just want to make sure I didn't screw the thing up.
Yeah. So look, I think that with dynasty rosters, you should really approach them and think about them with two different lenses. One lens being, how many points is this dynasty roster scoring, right? Just how we typically evaluate a fantasy team, right? But the other lens being, how is this team going to appreciate year over year? And, realistically, you could put together a dynasty roster with James Conner, Leonard Fournette, Aaron Rodgers, a bunch of older players who, they're going to produce this year. And they're not very expensive from a dynasty standpoint. You can get lucky and maybe win a championship by doing that, but you're putting all of your eggs in that 2022 basket. If you don't win this year, then you could really be screwed. You could be ruined moving forward. So you should also be concerned with how these players appreciate in the market. And by the market, I'm talking about average draft position and how they're valued 1 year to the next. So, the study that I did on how rookies appreciate in value really just looked at what happens whenever you draft a rookie in your rookie draft. What happens to that player's value year over year? Because every year, obviously, we get more rookies that enter the league, right? So you have these rookies 1 year. The next year, there's more rookies. There's also veterans that are already existing in the league. And so what I found was that in rounds 1 and 2, you're essentially watching about half of rookies that are drafted in rounds 1 and 2 of rookie drafts appreciate in value or get better in their startup ADP year over year. So half of your roster, let's just say that hypothetically, your entire roster was only rookies. That means that half of your roster would be getting better in terms of ADP year over year. That number was significantly lower when you're talking about veterans or guys who weren't rookies. And the reason why it was lower and the reason why it wasn't 50% and 50% is, again, rookies are entering the league and some of those guys are taking over these slots that veterans and other rookies had. So, this is really what the productive struggle idea is all about, is that in year one, when you enter and you draft your team, you're not so much looking to compete. It'd be nice if you end up winning and competing. But, what you're really trying to do is gobble up as much equity and value as you possibly can with these players from the lens of appreciation. And then later down the line, year 2, year 3, you're going to have a whole lot of value across your roster. And that value may be, maybe you drafted Jalen Waddle during his, when he was a rookie. And now all of a sudden you have a top 10, top 12 wide receiver that's going to produce like a top 15 one probably this year, or top 21, what have you. You're going to have production, but at the same time, you're going to have a lot of value that you can trade for more guaranteed production if need be. So it's really just a value game, and it's really about gobbling up players that are going to appreciate in value year over year.
Nice. Yeah, really interesting, man. And that's some nice foundings that you have. And continuing to talk about rookies, how do you evaluate talent, college production, and draft capital with situation and opportunity when comparing players such as Garrett Wilson to Sky Moore and Christian Watson, for instance? Still, in that matter, which rookies have you fallen in love with this year?
Yeah, so I think that the key thing to keep in mind with rookies and looking at talent versus situation is at the wide receiver position. Talent matters more than situation does, a lot more. Whereas at the running back position, situation can alter and change that equation a little bit. And just think of it intuitively. Think about it, what this all means just naturally, right? Wide receivers, in order to get a target, it's earned, right? They have to get open. They have to run a good route. They have to get open. The quarterback has to see them get open. Obviously, you want a quarterback to be able to distribute the ball well, but they have to get open in order to see that target in the first place, right? And that's a talent. That's talent. Everyone makes such a big deal out of drops. Like Deontay Johnson's drops a couple of years ago, and everyone's just like super, super upset about it and complaining about it every week. Deontay Johnson's getting targeted 160 plus times. He's getting open. That's why, because he's a good wide receiver. The drops are the result of something that's talent driven, right? But everyone's ignoring the talent driven piece that got to that point of drops, and they're focused on the drops. But you have to be good in order to have drops in the first place, because you have to get open. So at the wide receiver position, it's very, very important to focus on talent, especially in Dynasty when you're thinking more long-term. because situations change too, right? I mean, we see it all the time where quarterbacks are shifting. It's very, very rare for something to be very, very stagnant and static, during a player's entire rookie contract, right? And so, with running backs, a little bit different where you can get an Elijah Mitchell situation. Nothing against Elijah Mitchell. He's a good running back, but we all know that Elijah Mitchell was way better last year, just is in a better situation because of that Kyle Shanahan offense, because of the fact that, it opens up a lot of lanes. You can be more efficient. They're not afraid to feed a guy like that, etc. So, when it comes to talent versus, opportunity and situation and such, opportunity is often driven by talent, and the situation, at the extremes, you can care about the situation. Like, I think you can make the argument for like a Rashad Bateman, who I love as a player. But, he's going to be attached to Lamar Jackson the next, basically until he's not a Baltimore Raven anymore. And so, because of that, the Ravens with Lamar Jackson are likely going to be run heavy. I mean, last year they were a little bit more pass heavy, but they're likely going to be a run heavy team. And that caps Rashad Bateman's ceiling, to some degree. So in terms of the rookies that I like this year, and I like in rookie drafts in general, I think you can make an argument for any of the top wide receivers that were drafted in the first round. One guy who I've been getting everywhere because the fantasy community, I always say I don't hate players, I hate ADPs, right? So I'm not really concerned about, loving a player. It's whatever the market is doing, right? And one player where the market, I feel like, is just not on top of how good this guy is Jahan Dotson. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that he's not an early declare wide receiver, which is something that the analytics community and the fantasy community is really focused on for good reason. Early declare wide receivers, so guys who went to college for 3 years instead of 4, are generally better. It's an indictment of talent because they're leaving college early to go to the NFL, right? If you guys are leaving something, if you're leaving early, if you graduate high school a year early, it's because you're really smart, right? And so, with a player like Jahan Dotson, he went to Penn State for all 4 years. And so fantasy managers are like, I'm not that high on Jahan Dotson because he played a full 4 years at college. But realistically, he's going to walk into Washington, see at least a 15% target share this year, at least. And he has really good marks across the board. And people are drafting David Bell ahead of him. People are drafting Dameon Pierce ahead of Jahan Dotson in a lot of drafts. And I just can't get behind that when you're talking about a 16th overall pick. I mean, this isn't like a second rounder versus a third rounder. This is a mid first round pick. They're going to take a third rounder, David Bell, who I also love. I love David Bell. But it's, you have to think about a process. You have to be as logical as you can with this. And I think Jahan Dotson is someone who's going to surprise a lot of people.
Nice. So Derek will now make some questions from the audience.
Yeah, I'll pick some questions here. The first one is from Victor. First, he says, great live, JJ. What's your opinion regarding the MLB fight due to fantasy football?
Yeah, what's funny is when that all went down, I sent a tweet out that was very pro Jock Peterson, because I'm very much, I mean, you guys have listened to the show and such, but I'm very much someone who do whatever you want to do that's within the rules. If there's not a rule around something, or then you can do whatever you want. And apparently this whole vendetta and issue has come down to, like, I guess Jock Peterson using a player who was out in his IR spot when he wasn't actually on IR, which, as we know, you can do that on basically every platform. So I'm tweeting all this pro Jock Peterson stuff, and I realized, like, half a day later, 12 hours later, that Tommy Pham, the guy who slapped Jock Peterson, follows me on Twitter. And I'm sitting here and I'm saying all these things that are anti-Tommy Pham. Meanwhile, he's following me and he can see all this stuff. So I need to keep my mouth shut. I need to not talk about this. But yeah, I mean, I'm very much, do whatever you got to do that's within the rule.
That's awesome.
The second question is still from Victor. Is related to what's our input for Jalen Hurts on Dynasty Leagues? Where you rank him, because this whole situation with the Eagles, would they trying to get a new quarterback or something like that? No. What's your opinion on him?
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely become more bullish on Jalen Hurts this offseason. At the beginning of the offseason, I was pretty much in sell territory. Like, it didn't, if you could flip him for like a QB7 price tag, which is where he was at the beginning of the offseason, I mean, you could argue you still do that if you can get him at QB7. I think, though, that just given, I have him in redraft at like QB4, right, this season. And so if that's the case, then he has room for growth in terms of the way that people view him in their minds from right now until like September, October, when he starts producing, right? So if I think that he's going to produce, then you might as well wait a little bit to sell him once you see that production on the field. Because remember, the thing with Jalen Hurts and the thing with Dynasty in general is you want these quarterbacks who are going to be able to be starters for a long time, right? Whether they're really, really good or not, you just want that stability in some way. You know, Kirk Cousins is a very I've had Derek Carr is a better example. I've had Derek Carr on my like he's my highest rostered super flex player in general. I have no player more than Derek Carr across my leagues because years ago he was so cheap, but it was easy to see that he was going to be the starter at least, for a decent amount of time. And so, I just gobbled him up and traded for him and drafted him and such. And so that's what you need. You need that longevity. The thing with Derek Carr is his fantasy point production is here. Jalen Hurts' production is here, right? It's better. But Derek Carr has that longevity factor that I value a little bit more. Now, can Jalen Hurts be a starter long-term? It's all going to come down to this season, right? It's all going to come down to whether or not his arm improves this year. And the thing with Hurts is that obviously his value comes with his legs and fantasy, and NFL front offices don't weigh that enough. They actually should weigh it more. The ability, I always tell people the most valuable play in football is a Lamar Jackson rush, right? But people don't necessarily view Lamar Jackson the way they should view Lamar Jackson because of what he does with his arm. And that's how people evaluate quarterbacks, is how well they can throw the football, right? And so with Jalen Hurts, even if Jalen Hurts were a completely average quarterback with his arm and he had that component with his legs, he'd be a great starter, right? But he's just not there yet. So to me, since he's going to be good in fantasy, I'm pretty confident in that, with the AJ Brown addition. They have an easy front half schedule too. They have an easy schedule in general. I think that you could wait to sell Jalen Hurts, maybe halfway through the season. And then if things collapse down the stretch, he's not going to be their starter next year. Not only because things collapsed and he didn't play well in this hypothetical situation, but they have so much ammo in next year's draft that, they have 3 first rounders. I mean, they could do something to move up to get the quarterback that they want, that they need. And so I would not be shocked if that's the move that they make. So, I would not necessarily be looking to buy, but if I had Jalen Hurts, I'd wait it out a little.
Perfect. Yeah, and just to finish this one question from Jose Ferraz, of friends, between Elijah Moore or Gareth Wilson, who would you choose
in Dynasty?
Yeah, Dynasty. I think right now, I think right now I have Elijah Moore ahead of Garrett Wilson. And this is not because I think Garrett Wilson's incapable of being better than Elijah Moore. He actually ranked out a little bit better in my prospect model than Elijah Moore did, thanks to draft capital. Elijah Moore was a beast production. But the reason I would favor Elijah Moore over Garrett Wilson is because we've seen Elijah Moore do it. Elijah Moore has shown us that he could be a potential stud even at his size. And Garrett Wilson isn't that big either. I mean, there's size concerns for Garrett Wilson too. I wouldn't be shocked if next year Garrett Wilson's ahead of Elijah Moore, but I think the safer option is to go Elijah Moore.
Perfect.
Nice. So, digging more into your studies, JJ, and jumping 1 year ahead compared to the rookies, which players your year 2 model projects for the biggest increase in value for 2022?
Yeah, so I have this year 2 model that looks at so I have a prospect model that looks at these running backs and wide receivers coming out of school, and then the year 2 model looks at how they did in year 1 in the NFL and combines that with their prospect score, right? So there's some proprietary things that go into it that make it a little bit unique. So for instance, someone might say, well, what do we do with Elijah Mitchell? Elijah Mitchell comes out of nowhere after being a day 3 pick last year. He produces, he does well, but what does that mean? What have we seen historically with running backs like that? Well, historically, we've seen a few guys like Zach Stacy, Andre Ellington, James Robinson go through this similar trajectory of coming out of nowhere, producing well as rookies. Andre Ellington's was more as a receiver, but producing well as rookies from a points per game standpoint, and then tailing off, and you can utilize that information and look at a player's year 2 score. Elijah Mitchell, he's in like the 86th, 87th percentile, which if you're under the 90th percentile at running back or wide receiver, it's a little bit iffy. You get a little bit more iffy. Like you're not a stud, right? And if you're over the 95th percentile, you're in really, really good shape. Over 95th percentile players, give us a wide receiver 1 or a running back 1 season, high-end running back 1 season or high-end wide receiver 1 season at like a 50% hit rate. I mean, it's pretty out of control. So the guys who are above that mark at wide receiver from last year's class, you have Jamar Chase, obviously. I mean, he's going to probably do that this year. Jalen Waddle was there, Devontae Smith was there, and Elijah Moore was there. And then at running back, you had Najee Harris and Javonte Williams. And then right below that was Rashad Bateman at the 94th percentile. So any of those guys, totally good with all of them. I think that Elijah Moore and Devontae Smith in particular are really, really interesting as buy lows right now because what the teams just did at the position, but both of them can still thrive. Devontae Smith, very, very talented, can still see a 20+% target share in that offense. Elijah Moore just talked about, I think he's still better than Garrett Wilson from a dynasty ranking standpoint. So I'm not really concerned about the competition so much as given the cost has fallen with those guys. But if you want more of like an under the radar player that I think is going to be really interesting, I ran this model and I looked at it and I was like, holy crap, why haven't I thought about this guy, as someone to buy low on? It's Kenneth Gainwell. He's someone who my model liked a decent bit entering the NFL because he was a good pass catcher. A lot of guys from that Memphis program have been very interesting. They haven't necessarily been like studs, but Antonio Gibson and Darrell Henderson has flashed and Tony Pollard has flashed. Kenneth Gainwell is another one of those guys, and he was more productive than a lot of those guys at school as well. And so Kenneth Gainwell, to me, he's probably going to be able to carve out some sort of receiving role in that offense. It's not like there's this very, very established starter there. I think that he's a guy that you definitely want to throw a dart at right now if you can. He's only, the year 2 model, like I said, Elijah Mitchell was like an 87th percentile or so guy. Kenneth Gainwell was like 85th percentile. He was really close to Elijah Mitchell. Now, but look at the gap in the market between Elijah Mitchell and Kenneth Gainwell. Imagine trading away Elijah Mitchell, getting Kenneth Gainwell as just a throw-in, right? And so I think that Gainwell's a really interesting buy right now.
Good to hear. I have some good shares of Kenny Gainwell. And now for the question I'm looking for the most for the answer, I'd like to ask you that I saw on Twitter that you've just finished your redraft rankings for 2022. And what were your first broad conclusions while doing it? Maybe there's a position that's deeper or shallower than usual. Maybe you found out that it's worth out waiting on a position or maybe attacking it early. Conclusions.
Yeah, I think that the big thing right now in the fantasy world with my rankings, even all of that is the quarterback position and the fact that, if you look at, I published my ebook, The Late Round Quarterback, in 2012. That's what kind of got me going on this career path and doing this thing and being able to talk to a great audience. And when I published that ebook, 5 quarterbacks were being drafted in the first 2 rounds in terms of ADP. And slowly over the years, quarterbacks ADP has dropped, right? Like we don't see that anymore. And I'm not saying it's because of my ebook or because of me. It's not really, I don't really think that's the majority of the reason. I think that some people, sure, they started drafting quarterbacks late because they ended up reading my ebook or saw my work. But I think a lot of it just has to do with what the quarterback position was doing, over the last 10 years, maybe before 2020. And what the quarterback position was doing was that it was incredibly unpredictable. If you look at top 18 quarterbacks by ADP and you compare that and you find the correlation between top 18 quarterbacks, by the way, I haven't even shared this information on like my podcast or anything yet. So you guys are hearing it first. But if you look at top 18 quarterbacks and you compare that by ADP, so preseason, right? And you compare that to how those quarterbacks scored and you look at their points per game and you find the correlation between the two. So obviously a higher correlation would mean that we were better at predicting which quarterbacks were going to be good in that given season. Back in like 2015 and in 2018, the R squared, so the correlation between those two variables, was literally 0. It was 0. There was one season in 2015, that was Cam Newton's MVP season. That year, the top 9 quarterbacks averaged basically the same number of points per game as the next 9 did. That's how bad we were at. No, I wouldn't say that's how bad we were at predicting which quarterback was going to be good. It's just the way the quarterback position sort of flushed out, right? And worked. Now, through the years, the highest R squared value, when you're looking at top 18 quarterbacks from 2011 to 2019, the highest R squared value was like 36%, it was like 0.36. So, it was not super, super high for anyone who doesn't understand what that means and doesn't care for math. Most of the R squared values were in the teens. It wasn't that high. It was like, 15 to 20%. The last 2 years, in 2020 and in 2021, the R squared value has been 55% and 58%. And so what that tells you is over the last 2 seasons in fantasy football, we've been very, very good at predicting which quarterbacks are going to be good in fantasy. And I think it comes down to the fact that the market finally is valuing rushing properly. The market finally understands that mobile quarterbacks are very valuable in fantasy, and they're drafting them as such, right? And so what happens is, if you look at the point differential from the best quarterback to the 12th best quarterback, whatever, if you look at any sort of value over replacement level formula, the point differential really isn't that much different, last year or the year before that than it was in 2014. But the difference is that we're better at spotting which quarterback is going to be good. And I think that confidence is going to drive a quarterback market to be drafted higher, and these quarterbacks to be drafted higher. And honestly, in my rankings, quarterbacks are going a little bit higher as well, because you feel so good about the top 10 to 12 quarterbacks in fantasy before that drop really hits with those QB2s. So it's just really interesting to me. I think that the way that the game is right now, where we have these unicorn players who can throw the ball really well and run the ball really well, it drives up their price. I think there's a decent reason for that, but there's going to be a season. There's going to be a season where we don't predict the quarterback position nearly as well. It could happen this year. And if you're ahead of the game and you can recognize that, and if you're drafting a ton of teams and you're able to get some late round quarterbacks and end up hitting, then you're going to be at a huge, huge advantage compared to your competition.
Yeah, we have 2 questions in these lines, right? That will make you to JJ right now.
Right, exactly. The first one comes to our friend Guilherme Giannis, Fantasy Futebolista. He asked regarding the new explanation to new fantasy players, why drafting late QBs is the best option. You talk about a little bit in this moment, but if you could simplify the thing, just to see if I'm understand correctly. The difference between the first QB to the 19th QB, firstly, is the difference in points. It's shallow, usually compared to other positions, and we can't predict very accurately who will be the top 10, for example, which goes in those line, right?
Yeah. I would say, if you were to ask someone, or someone were to ask you, why should I, never played fantasy before, why should I draft a quarterback late whenever it's the most important position in real football, right? And I would say, think of it this way. I think a lot of people can grasp a value over replacement player idea, right? Where you're not necessarily trying to score the most points across positions. You're trying to score the most points within positions. You want your wide receiver to beat all wide receivers, not beat tight ends. It doesn't really matter unless you're having a bunch of flex spots, right? And so with the quarterback position, let's just pretend that a quarterback scores 80 points more than a baseline quarterback, a replacement level quarterback in your projections. And a wide receiver is supposed to score 50 more points than his baseline player. Would that tell you to draft the quarterback over the wide receiver? Well, basic value over replacement player would say, that you should get a quarterback because he has a larger point margin between his replacement level player versus the wide receiver. But there's a supply and demand formula that happens in fantasy drafts, because you're only starting one quarterback. You're starting multiple wide receivers. You're starting multiple running backs. And what happens is usable quarterbacks are then able to be drafted late, right? Because there's only, there's 12 teams in your league. There's 12 starting quarterbacks. People are able to wait on the position because they don't need it as much. And so that 80-point differential is being stretched across a lot of rounds, right? You can get that guy, that replacement level player, in round 15, whereas the replacement level player at wide receiver might be drafted in round 5 or 6. And so your opportunity cost then becomes a lot greater when you get a quarterback early versus getting another position.
Perfect. And continue with the quarterback situation. Giuseppe has asked you regarding the second year breakout QB. So Trey Lance, Fields, Lawrence, and so goes on.
Yeah. I'm in on Trey Lance. I know that there's a lot of negative reports at times. It seems to be like going away a little bit. The fact that Jimmy Garoppolo is still there doesn't really worry me because his coach is literally talking to the media saying they're trying to trade him after the surgery is all done and he's able to recover. Trey Lance has the mobility that we love to see. He has the arm, he has the weapons. I am very much in on Trey Lance this year. My projections like him as a top 10 quarterback, and you can get him as a top 12-ish quarterback right now. So I will be drafting Trey Lance.
Nice. Yeah. I'm getting Trey Lance everywhere in my dynasty league. So yeah. I'm excited as well. In the same lines of what you said, JJ, about the Giants in one of your latest mailbag episodes of the podcast, do you think we can identify Jaguars players as potential values considering the change at coaching staff and where they are being drafted? I'm particularly high on Travis Etienne. I think he has a shot to be a running back one in PPR leagues.
Yeah, I think that the Jags are definitely a team that makes sense and sort of are within that same umbrella as the Giants, where the Giants, one of the driving forces behind liking the Giants is because their ADPs are so depreciated. I mean, no one wants New York Giants players right now. I mean, Kadarius Toney is still going past wide receiver 50. Kenny Golladay, who I like Toney more than Golladay, but Kenny Golladay is going, wide receiver 60-ish. And, no one cares about Ricky Seals-Jones being a tight end there. It's just Saquon, really. That's the only player that people are loving. And a lot of it has to do with the Dable effect, obviously, and him going to New York. But it's also when teams are so bad at scoring touchdowns one year, they generally are a lot better the next year. Natural regression, it just happens. Teams convert touchdowns at a higher rate just naturally, but also because things change when teams are really bad. Like it's the same thing when teams are really good and they're converting at a really high rate. They either, a lot of things probably went their way in order for them to be so good in that given season. A lot of injuries probably went their way. Even last year with Cincinnati, Joe Burrow and that offense, they did very well. They scored a lot of touchdowns. Joe Burrow had a top 10 yards per attempt rate of all time last year. But think about it. All of those wide receivers, they stayed relatively healthy all season long. What happens if Jamar Chase goes down for 4 weeks? What happens if even Tyler Boyd gets injured? That didn't really, T. Higgins was banged up a little bit last year, but that didn't really happen for an extended period of time. And so, that's another reason why regression just naturally exists. So that's why I like the Giants. But then, the Jags, I think you can make the exact same argument for, just slotting Christian Kirk instead of Kadarius Toney. I think Christian Kirk could see a lot of looks in that offense. Even Evan Ingram as a late round dart throw, I think is really interesting, in that Peterson offense that likes to feature the tight end. So I'm definitely, in on Jacksonville. I actually did a draft earlier this week and I had a Jacksonville stack. So I'm in.
Nice. Also, JJ, referring to a topic of one of your last podcasts, can you please tell us a brief explanation of the concept of the ambiguous backfields and name a few that you may be targeting in current or upcoming drafts this season? Are those running backs from ambiguous backfields the best targets in the middle rounds this year?
Yeah. So, the idea of ambiguous backfields is when you're drafting a middle or late round running back, you do not want to draft that running back on a team with an established starter. And it sounds so freaking obvious, right? Like, of course, you don't want to draft an RB2, a team RB2, when there's a team RB1 that's established in that offense. But we see it every year where these team RB2s are, these middle round picks where they have, a stud or a very established player ahead of them. Not only that, but in the middle rounds, over the last 10 years or so, we've seen probably like a 60-40 split when looking at, and this is between like round 6 and 9. We've seen about a 60-40 split when looking at team RB1s versus team RB2s. What I mean by that is, this year, Miles Sanders is a team RB1 by ADP because he's the first running back from the Eagles getting drafted in fantasy drafts. Whereas a guy like Tony Pollard is a team RB2 because Ezekiel Elliott gets drafted ahead of him, right? So historically, team RB1s have hit at a pretty substantially better rate than team RB2s have in the middle rounds. And then in the late rounds, if you're looking at double digit rounds, as the backfield becomes more ambiguous, the higher the hit rate. So basically, if you have a late round running back, you're in round 11, round 12, and you're looking at a running back, if that running back has a teammate that's drafted in rounds 1 and 2, that's a very low hit rate. If he's drafted in rounds 3 through 5, that's a little bit better. But if his top running back teammates drafted between rounds 6 through 9, then that's a really good look because it's an ambiguous backfield, right? It's easier to overtake that backfield. There's also some interesting variations to this as well, where, if you are going to take an RB2 in the middle rounds, it's better to get an RB2 that has an RB1 teammate who's in the running back dead zone, which is rounds like 3 through 6, rounds 3 through 5. And the reason for that, I think, is because often the running back dead zone exists because fantasy managers are pushing up the ADP of these running backs because they need a running back and they panic and they just draft a guy who may not be very complete, but it's a running back to fill their roster. But what that tells you is that the running back himself is not necessarily that good and can be taken over in some way. And so if there's an RB2 on that guy's team being drafted in the middle rounds, that tells you that the RB2 is probably decent because he's a middle round pick. Like, he's probably talented in the first place, but then it's pretty easy for him to take over a little bit more work because the RB1 on his team is a little bit overvalued, overinflated, maybe isn't as good as we think. So good example of that is Tariq Cohen back in the day when Jordan Howard was his RB1. Jordan Howard wasn't a pass catcher. Tariq Cohen was. Boom, electric player, really good talent, able to come through in fantasy. So there's little iterations to it. And then this season, couple backfields, I think CEH is someone that I'm going after as an RB1 on his own team from an ADP perspective. He really fits the bill. And then one of those examples of an RB2 in a backfield where the RB1 is sort of going in the dead zone is Tony Pollard, where Pollard is, again, in a decent spot to at least get some production, but there's upside if this really is the end for Zeke.
Nice. Now Derek will make a question. One from him and one from the audience. Derek, please.
Firstly, continuing with the whole running back 1, running back 2 conversation, Felipe Felix brings you a question. Should we worry about Aaron Jones? Because the whole situation with AJ Dillon, how well he did last year. What are your thoughts regarding that?
Yeah, look, I think that Aaron Jones has been, how should I say this? I think that his ADP has gotten a little inflated over the last couple of weeks because a lot of people are touting him. And I get it. I understand. I think the main reason, is because, if you look at his splits without Devontae Adams, historically, there's been like 8 games where Devontae Adams has missed the majority of the game or not played. And Aaron Jones's target share is insane. He's averaging like 6 or 7 targets a game and all that. It's a small sample size, number one. And number two, there's a lot of touchdown equity that's been had by Aaron Jones in those scenarios. And AJ Dillon wasn't involved in those scenarios. And I think that's important here. So Aaron Jones, I mean, I love him. He was one of my favorite. He's one of my best call, the best call that my prospect model's ever made. Really. And I love the guy. Like, he's great. But I do think that at this point with AJ Dillon there, you have to worry a little bit about that touchdown equity because they started to use AJ Dillon a lot at the goal line down the stretch line.
Perfect. We'll continue with this one from Wilson, Souza. He asked you regarding those high stake leagues. Do you play? Or if you do, did you win a lot? How do you see this kind of league?
So I won't speak to the high stakes stuff. But I the way I answer this always to people is I'm profitable every year when I play fantasy. And I am not someone who I try not to like be overly touty because I don't think I need to be. Like, I think if people are listening to my content and they're sticking with my content, it means they're winning and it's helping them. And they like the way that they're thinking after listening to the content. Whereas there's a lot of people who sort of approach the touting game as like, I did this or I did this, but I don't think it's necessarily about that. I think that if you're getting enough from my content and what I'm producing, then that's good enough. That's what's necessary. I don't need to go out and talk about my winnings and stuff, but I'll at least say I am profitable each year in fantasy football.
Perfect. And just 2 more questions, this time for me. The first one is regarding Dynasty Superflex. How do you approach the whole QB situation? Do you start at least with 1 QB in the first round? What's your strategy regarding that? Or you continue with late round QBs? How do you
in startup drafts, right?
Yes, in startup drafts.
Yeah, no, quarterbacks are currency in Superflex leagues. So, you could even, on my Patreon, I publish Superflex Dynasty rankings once a month, and all my rankings are actually, I'm higher on quarterbacks in my rankings than the market is. And it's because in a startup draft, quarterbacks there's a saying, it goes something like, in startup drafts, quarterbacks are the cheapest they're ever going to be. Because if you finish a startup draft and if you need a quarterback, you know how hard it is to trade for a quarterback in a dynasty superflex league. And so you want to gobble up as many as you can, and you can feel like you're overpaying, on the position a little bit, but quarterbacks are currency, man. They're so important in that format. So I am, I'll at least get one in the first round and then kind of go, it depends on where I'm at in the draft, obviously, but get one in the first couple of rounds and kind of go from there.
Perfect. And the last question is regarding Kenny Pickett. How do you think about him? You studied in Pitt's University, right?
I did. I went to Pitt. Yeah.
Oh, nice. Yeah. So as a Steeler fan, how do you see them? In this case, maybe it's the Steeler fan here. So what do you think he's gonna do? Why do you think the Steelers decide to go with him instead of the other QBs in the draft board?
Just a disclaimer: Derek is a Steelers fan, so
yeah.
Nice.
So
yeah, so I went to Pitt, and I actually was at I live in Charlotte now, and the ACC championship game is played in Charlotte every year. So I was at the ACC championship when Pitt played Wake Forest this year, when Kenny Pickett had that fake slide, that they changed the rule for him. I was at that game actually. Cool. And it was awesome because Pitt won. They steamrolled them, and I got to celebrate. It was great. So I love Kenny Pickett from like a human standpoint, from a fandom standpoint, all of that. But I have to be objective. I think that Pickett is a safe option. Who, going back to that Derek Carr example that I shared, I wouldn't be shocked if he's like, if the Steelers just stick with him, even if he struggles a little bit, through his rookie contract. And so I think because that's what the Steelers do. He's in a good situation. Their offensive coordinator, Matt Canada, is someone who will run an offense, a style offense that Kenny Pickett will be able to thrive in, and that they weren't able to run with Ben Roethlisberger because he was a statue back there. And so I'm excited about that. Like, I think that the situation for Pickett could not be better. It's absolutely perfect for Pickett himself. And the Steelers, as we know, are not an organization that likes to rebuild. They haven't rebuilt they haven't really rebuilt my entire life, right? Like they're just always competitive, and they just don't believe in that. And so I think what they saw was, okay, we have Mitch Trubisky right now. He's fine enough, but we have Kenny Pickett, who's probably an upgrade even right away. Maybe he doesn't have as big of a ceiling, but we have a great defense right now. And we have pieces around Pickett and whoever the quarterback would be. We can probably be decent right away, in their minds. In my opinion, the AFC is going to be so freaking competitive that it's going to be very difficult for them to really compete. But in their minds, it's Mike Tomlin and the Steelers, and so they're going to try to win all the time. And I think that drove a lot of what they did in getting Pickett. And they saw him all the time, same facility that Pitt worked out at, played at. So they were familiar with him. And even though it's kind of lame, I do think that the familiarity aspect does play a role in that kind of thing.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, JJ. Now going back to redraft mode, it seems to me that this year age will be an especially big factor compared to last year's for the running backs, as many of the best ones are already entering their age 26 or age 27 season. I mean, 8 of the top 12 running backs by ADP are already 26 years old or older. What to think of it? How much caution should we have before drafting one of these older guys?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily worry a ton from a redraft standpoint this year. Where I would worry is when you get into, because if you think of it this way, there's a reason that those guys are being drafted where they're being drafted. Of course, some of them are going to end up busting. Derrick Henry, maybe Kamara. I mean, someone is going to end up not living up to expectation because it happens every single season. But I do think that when you get into, think about why their ADPs are where they are. It's because they're very good, right? And the market agrees that they're all very good. Joe Mixon's although Joe Mixon's still like 22 years old because he entered the league when he was like 12. But these guys are all very, very good at football, and they're going to see a big workload. It's easier to buy into that from a redraft standpoint versus a dynasty standpoint. Where I would be a little bit concerned is when you get a non-young player who's not being drafted early, because what that signals is that they're on the downturn of their career, right? Like the chance that a non-pass, like primarily pass catching running back in the middle rounds really pans out is just not very, or at least is a league winner, is just not very high. And so I would avoid those kinds of players a lot more from an age standpoint than the early round guys. But, just given the landscape and where things are at right now, I think that they're still okay enough to draft.
Nice, JJ. So nearing the end of our show today, we have talked about some of your theories regarding late round quarterback and ambiguous backfields. Tell us how your thoughts have changed and evolved, and if they did change when thinking about those two strategies, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the late round quarterback strategy has definitely shifted, over through the last couple of years. And it's funny. I have people that'll hit me up and they're like, "Oh, are you so upset that people are drafting quarterbacks earlier? And like, are you still team late round QB?" And I get really frustrated because 3 years ago I was writing about how middle round quarterbacks were a lot more attractive in fantasy than they were, a handful of years before that. And like, I felt like it was one of the, you don't always have those moments where you're ahead of the game, where you're like, you feel good about the analysis that you did. But with that, I felt really good about it, and it's come to fruition. And yet people are still associating the late round quarterback thing with me for good, for obvious reasons. But, it's just one of those things where things have shifted at the quarterback position. I think it just goes back to the stuff I talked about earlier with us just being very good at predicting which quarterbacks are going to be good. It makes it harder to find those late round quarterback gems.
Nice. And can you remember some individual players or seasons that most made a difference in those theories that you created?
Yeah, I would say, for you're obviously weighing what happened the previous season most with what you're doing, just because it's the most relevant recent data. And so I do think that, to the quarterback discussion, what Josh Allen's been able to do and what he did even last year, and him just continuously destroying in fantasy, definitely, it's something that makes you change and adjust your approach. So I guess that would be my answer, is just Josh Allen the last couple of years.
Nice. And we have a great deal of Brazilians, including some members of our crew, playing in the Scott Fishbowl 12 this year. And how much do you like playing leagues with unorthodox formats like the Scott Fishbowl? And do you have any hints at this year's rules and structure? Did Scott tell you something that you can spoil to us?
No, I have nothing about the rules. Scott keeps that pretty hush hush. And so I don't have anything there. I will say I don't mind formats that, change rules up and such. My only thing is I just want at least some way of forecasting it, predicting it, being able to like use your brain to figure out like ways to attack a certain league. I don't want randomness. I don't want things to just happen at random and just get lucky. I really want that skill component to be involved in fantasy football. So as long as that's still involved, I don't care what the format is.
Nice. So to wrap things up, the last questions from the audience, and then we'll make our final greetings. Go ahead, Derek, please.
All right. So Joseph Haas have one question regarding first round picks. How do you value them? Especially the 2023 picks, because there is a lot of good guys coming next year. So how do you see? Should him trade down and start up draft? What do you think about that?
Yeah. Look, if you can gobble up as many 2023 rookie picks as you can, I would do it. There are multiple stud running backs and wide receivers coming out of that class. Things can change, and I think generally people overstate and understate these kinds of things. But at the very least, if you stockpile 2023 picks, you're at least gaining that equity and gaining that value that I talked about earlier. So the very least, you're able to do that. If you're able to just like swap, a late 2022 first for a random 2023 first, I would do that. Even though, historically, and the way that you handle in dynasty and stuff, you don't want to just switch picks from one year to the next when you're getting the later year pick, because that means that you're losing some value there. But I think in this case, you can do that just because the 2023 class is that good.
Yeah. Do you have any names that you're most excited about this 2023 class?
Yeah, I usually don't start prospecting until January after the college football season's over. But Jackson Smith and Jigma from Ohio State. You have these two wideouts in Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson that came out this year. Jamison Williams was also on that Ohio State team before he transferred to Alabama. And Jackson Smith and Jigba was a freshman on that team who was outperforming some of those first-round picks, and a sophomore on the team who was outperforming those first-round picks. He was the best wide receiver on Ohio State last year as a sophomore, and he was outproducing and outperforming 2 mid-round first-round picks. He's going to be probably a top 5. He's another Jamar Chase type prospect.
Yeah, it's just insane, right? And we have a last question here from my dear friend Joseph Haas. Who is your favorite late round quarterback for this year, JJ?
Yeah, I sort of tier guys now. I think of them in terms of like different sections of your draft. If you were, I'm not going to probably be getting Josh Allen. I'm probably not going to be getting a lot of like, maybe, I basically, that top tier, whoever falls and is drafted last is the one that I'll gobble up. So oftentimes it's been Jalen Hurts. I think Jalen Hurts is, he goes QB7. I think he's more QB4. So there's some equity to be had there. And then sort of the chunk after that, if Russell Wilson falls, I'm cool with getting Russell Wilson. I think he's in a really good spot, obviously, this year. And then, after that, if Trey Lance, in that like round 10-ish range, he's probably the more like the sort of traditional late round quarterback, the last quarterback that'll be drafted in your home league, that kind of deal. But then if you want to go super, super late, like super, super late, I'm going to go with Daniel Jones, Danny Dimes as the super, 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 super late dart throw, Hail Mary type play, easiest schedule in the league by win total, good rushing. He averaged the same number of points per game last year as Derek Carr did. Now he gets Brian Dable, who's going to just let him loose like he did with Josh Allen. Not to say that he's going to be Josh Allen. Decent enough weapons there. I'm excited to see what Danny Dimes can do. And if he doesn't, if he gets benched, it's redraft. You can just pick up another quarterback.
Yeah. So considering Bretas, my friend, is one of the biggest fans of Daniel Jones.
Awesome.
I would like to ask you, Bretas, if you have one last question for JJ.
Actually, I do. It's a simple question, actually, but I just got curious when you said that Jalen Hurts is your QB4 this year. I agree. When I look at his projections, for example, I get really excited. But it seems that this year everyone is ranking quarterbacks differently in the top 6. Who are your first 3?
Yeah, I think I have at 1, I have Josh Allen. At 2, I think I have Justin Herbert right now. And I think 3, I have Lamar. The Lamar thing, I think they're going to go back to being pretty run heavy. And, he could get nice touchdown equity out of that. I can make an argument for Jalen Hurts. So I think that they're all, Josh Allen aside, they're all in a similar-ish tier. And then like I'm lower on Mahomes than the consensus is. I'm lower on Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow, I think, is one of the most mispriced quarterbacks in fantasy football right now. He's QB6 on Underdog. I think a lot of that, or some of it, has to do with the fact that people are trying to stack him, right? So they reach for him a little bit. But he's QB6 on Underdog. He came out in my projections as QB12. It's not, I don't mind Burrow, of course, but if you look at the things that he did last year, again, he had top 10 yards per attempt rate of all time. His touchdown rate was a little bit high. There's just a lot of things, a lot of small things that sort of went his way that likely won't go his way this year. And so I think Burrow is someone who, I would love to have in Dynasty. He's going to be the quarterback for a super, super long time, but I do think in redraft, there's a lot. I mean, I honestly think you can make the argument, and people might destroy me for this, but I think you can make an argument that Trey Lance is a better pick than Joe Burrow in redraft. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if Trey Lance outscores him.
Yeah, and in these lines, where do you see Tom Brady, who is the ultimate pocket passer, but has these great weapons and in his farewell season?
Yeah, what's funny about Brady is, I don't mind him. I think he's a top 10-ish quarterback. That's, I like him more than like an Aaron Rodgers right now, because Aaron Rodgers just doesn't have, the weapons to feel confident about him. But the thing that's weird about Brady is that his weapons aren't just worse than last year. They're a lot worse because Chris Godwin's banged up. He's going to come back. We don't even know, like Chris Godwin's being drafted like he's completely healthy right now. Whereas, who knows when he's going to come back? Like he tore his ACL late in the season last year. And so, you have Godwin, question mark. Russell Gage is fine. He's good. but he's not Antonio Brown, as ridiculous as Antonio Brown is. So I'm a little, and Gronk isn't back yet, although I've drafted more Rob Gronkowski than any other human on this planet probably so far this year. I just don't see a scenario where he doesn't come back. And right now he's tight end like 13, 14. And if he signs today, if he's a Tampa Bay Buccaneer, he's gonna be what, tight end 7, tight end 6 maybe. And so I think that there's a good chance that he's gonna be back, and so he'll see that rise in ADP. But I think there's question marks with a guy like Brady still. I think there's question marks with Aaron Rodgers given their weapons. So again, that makes me more inclined to just like go after the Trey Lance type that has that crazy ceiling where, he might not hit, but he should be decent enough because of his rushing floor.
Nice. So we thank you very, very much, JJ. Just want to let my friends say their last regards, their last greetings, and any messages to the audience as well. And so go on, Derek, please. Thank you for helping me here and being in another live in our great channel on YouTube.
Of course.
Thank you very much, JJ. I really learned a lot today. So regarding different kind of approaches, it was really interesting. And feel free to come here more anytime you want. So just DM us and say, oh, would like to make a live in Portuguese sometimes. We'll feel free to teach you a few words in Portuguese, and we're ready to go.
Nice.
And also tell us where can we find your work, your Patreon, your site. Where can I find you on Twitter, for example? So
I'm on Twitter at LateRoundQB. All my stuff is over on LateRound.com. Got Late Round Fantasy Football there. There's a Patreon where I give my rankings and such. If you're a $10 patron, the higher tier, you can join the Discord, which is pretty fun. And I'm in the Discord all day long. And then I have a draft guide that's publishing on July 1st that I really, really need to work more on because it's not done yet, not even close to done. But that'll be out on July 1st. And I'll update that weekly, and it'll come to people's email inboxes. If you don't want to spend any money, which I totally get, you can at least sign up for my newsletter, completely free. You get all my content, my written content to your inbox. So at least, do that. Go to lateround.com.
Yes, please. So now, Bretas, my great friend, your last message for our great guest and the public, please.
Thanks, JJ. It's been an honor to have you here. I think I learned a lot. There were some great insights today, and it was even better to see that we agree on many things. So I was really happy about it. And welcome to come here with us anytime you want. It will be always great. I'll keep following you and learning a lot.
Appreciate it.
Yes, and don't forget to sign up to the newsletter. And okay, so JJ, any last message to our audience? Everybody loved here. Our chat is pumping, so thank you very, very much. The Brazilian audience loves you. The Brazilian fantasy football community have you as an example. You can be sure of that.
I appreciate that, and all the support from Brazil has been awesome. It's been like the one country that I always see. Like I feel like my like even like the podcast rankings and stuff and fantasy football or fantasy sports in Brazil, my podcast is always ranked higher in Brazil more than any other country. So always appreciate the support. Maybe someday I'll be able to learn Portuguese a little bit and hop on and just speak fluently with you guys, help you out a little bit. It'd be great.
Yeah, we'll be here to help you.
Nice.
Bom, galera, é isso aí, uma live especialíssima, mais uma aqui para o nosso cardápio no canal do YouTube. Podem ter certeza que não terminou por aqui, mês que vem já tem uma coisa bastante engatilhada, mas a gente vai deixar no suspense por enquanto, então continuem aí acompanhando o nosso trabalho nas redes sociais, no site, aqui no canal do YouTube, nos podcasts também, já que essa live estará disponível na versão áudio logo mais, e se inscrevam em todos os nossos canais para não perder nenhum conteúdo de primeira como esse, sendo que semana que vem já vai chegar outro podcast bem bacana de toda a nossa equipe, dando as famosas bold predictions aí, as nossas previsões corajosas, para vocês já tirarem o print e nos cobrarem lá em dezembro, porque é certeza que pelo menos eu vou errar e cair de cara. Então, galera, muito obrigado a todo mundo que acompanhou, um grande abraço e até a próxima.